Well, good afternoon and welcome everybody to episode 4 of the C.H.B.A. Law Club podcast. My name is Nate Dunn, and with us today, we are very excited to have candidate for the Alameda County District Attorney, Seth Steward, who joins us today. Mr. Steward is also a former assistant district attorney for the San Francisco District Attorney's Office, and he's chief of staff to Oakland City Council member Dan Cobb. He's a adjunct professor at Merritt College, and he's also been a special missions aviator for the U.S. Air Force. So thank you for your service, Seth, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me. This is an exciting program that Charles Houston Bar Association is doing, and I'm excited to be a part of it. This is really cool.
Yeah, we've got a number of C.H.B.A. alumni who are running for the Alameda County District Attorney's Office, and this is an open invitation to all of you to join us. But Seth, you are our first actual live interview for the Law Club podcast, and you're a trailblazer in that regard. It's also actually my first live podcast interview. Our first couple of episodes, we've used our recorded programs and adapted those into the podcast format. So we'll see how this goes today. I'm cutting my teeth, but glad to have you on this afternoon. So the Alameda County District Attorney position that you are running for, when did it click over in your mind that you wanted to be the next Alameda County District Attorney?
Pretty late last year. The other 3 candidates had already announced, and I had given it a lot of thought once the current district attorney, Nancy O'Malley, announced that she was going to step down. I got a number of phone calls. People were very excited and said, hey, Seth, you should really think about this. And a lot of people kind of supporting or really urging me to strongly consider it. And at the time, I really didn't. I thought about it a lot, but it wasn't really something that I was going to really focus on. But the more I thought about it and the more I spent some time on it, I really came around to the conclusion that the type of experience that I have, both as a prosecutor, as a public servant, as a public school teacher, and as a veteran, really lends itself to the changing criminal justice system that's happening right now, and what I think should be happening in Alameda County.
And in terms of what you're describing as some of the changes that are happening in the criminal justice system, what are some of the changes that you've noticed that you want to either support in a positive way or fix?
So I'll just talk about a couple of things here. Last year in the city of Oakland alone, we had 134 murders. So whatever it is we're doing right now isn't working. We're not keeping people safe. People don't feel safe. And that's the number one goal, the first thing that has to happen to become a DA or to be the DA. The district attorney's office needs people to be able to be safe. And so we have to focus on violent crimes. That's the first thing that needs to happen. In addition to that, I noticed that there are a number of alternative courts or collaborative courts that we call them, but I don't think they're used as effectively as they could be, and they're underutilized. So we need to send more cases to those types of courts, whether it's behavioral health court or veterans court or drug court or youth diversion court. All of these different courts, essentially what they do is they give people a different opportunity than a traditional court system. They provide services, they give improve cognitive abilities and emotional intelligence, and give people different options. So when they're forced or have an opportunity to make a choice about whether to make a criminal action or to take a non-criminal action, they're much more likely to take a non-criminal action in the future. And so those type of courts are incredibly powerful and effective, and we need to have stronger implementation with regard to those courts. And then finally, we need to lead outside the courtroom. And for me, what that means is I know as an educator, and I believe that the best way, the fastest, most effective way to reduce the crime rate is to increase the high school graduation rate. When that graduation rate goes up, crime goes down. And so we need to work with the school boards of the cities and the Alameda County Department of Education and the Alameda County School Board, and in addition to the Alameda County Department of Public Health, because I think it's also clear that gun violence is a public health crisis. And so we need to work with our community partners to be able to find innovative ways to address the roots of crime. And I think that having conversations with people outside of the criminal justice system to try to focus on those things is imperative to be able to be successful in the long term.
Have you seen any trends? And I'm talking about the last 2 years since COVID hit, and I think most of us had a dramatic change in our day-to-day lives and everything like that. Have you seen any trends in crime or in the criminal justice system over the last 2 years that are directly attributable to not necessarily COVID, but the fact that people have been either lost work because of what happened, or are now working in different jobs than they would have before under different circumstances and things like that? Have you seen any sort of trends locally over the past 2 years in that regard?
So I'll take a step back and say, initially, I think what your question is asking is about the relationship between the economy and crime. So traditionally, people understand that there's almost like an inverse relationship. So if the economy goes down, crime goes up. But that said, that isn't necessarily true. So when in 2008, when the economy kind of hit a pretty big decrease, crime didn't necessarily skyrocket. And so that isn't necessarily the indirect relationship that we think it is. That said, I think to address COVID generally, or the effects of COVID and all the ancillary effects of COVID, a lot of what's happened is as we're meeting on Zoom in this conversation and opposed to having it in person, a lot of the neighborhood services, community services, all of the ability for the programs to be able to have face-to-face conversations and be able to have a real impact in the community were truncated and really stifled by the effects of COVID. And so one of the ways that happened is Ceasefire here in the city of Oakland, which is a program where there's a call-in section where the police department says, hey, all of the people that we think are potentially going to commit violent crime, we're going to bring all these people in and have a conversation and provide all of these services. It's much harder to do over Zoom. It's a hard way to present these services and have these services be available to these folks via Zoom. So I think that that's one of the things that's really caused a lot of problems.
I want to back up a little bit and talk about what first inspired you to be a prosecutor. I think that as law students, law students frequently get asked, what do you want to do when you graduate? I know for me, the question was always, I just want a job. Like I got these student loans. I'm just trying to figure out, how to pay those. And, you see classmates that are going off and working off in big firms and everything like that. Other people are clerking for judges and is trying to figure out what the next steps are as a law student, especially for folks that might not have a parent or a family member who's already a lawyer who can kind of steer them in one direction or another. For you, what inspired you to be a prosecutor?
So I actually, one of the main reason I went to law school was based on a couple of conversations that kind of guide a lot of my career decisions on whether or not I sleep well at night.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's the way that everybody does it, but it's the way that I was doing it back then. And I still give it a little bit more thought, but that's most of the time it. And so in this instance, I was in the mayor's office of neighborhood services in San Francisco a number of years ago. And there had been a string of violent murders in the neighborhood that I was working in, the Fillmore, which is a historically African-American community. And so a lot of younger Black men were being killed. And the mayor's office is not a criminal justice institution. It doesn't really solve crime. It doesn't really prosecute crime. It doesn't do any of those things. And so, but what it does do is it has money. And so it used this money to develop rewards leading to the arrest, prosecution, and conviction of and the people that have killed the various different victims of violent crime in the Fillmore. And we had these posters with the photo of the victim, and they were printed and put all around the neighborhood and the community. And I went to a number of different community meetings to talk about this and to try to drum up information around these different deaths that had occurred. And I remember distinctly an older African-American woman coming up to me after one of these meetings in a police station, in a community meeting. And she looked me dead in the eye and she said, "What are you doing about the death of my grandson?" And I had just explained all of the reward stuff. And so I went through it again, but I knew that that wasn't a sufficient answer. It just wasn't good enough. And it was causing me, I was like, that's not a good enough answer. So one of the main reasons I wanted to become a prosecutor was to reduce crime, to hopefully have less violent crime, less murders than we had at the time when I was in the mayor's office.
And do you find yourself as a prosecutor serving a dual role of, on the one hand, achieving justice for the victims and the families of certain crimes, but on the other side, being a gatekeeper in terms of not necessarily trying to win every case because winning is important, but in terms of looking at the evidence and making a judgment call of, I think that this case has merit versus I think this case doesn't have merit. Do you see yourself in those two roles, and how do you balance those two roles?
Absolutely, I think that it's important, and I'll say something about the word that you just used about winning a case, because I think that's typically the words that we use when we talk about cases winning and losing. And I'd like to suggest a different way of thinking about it. When a jury comes back with a conviction on a case, I don't necessarily think about it as a win. I think about it. There's this great movie that stars, short story. There's a great movie called Magnificent Seven. Not the new one with Denzel Washington, which is good, but the older one with Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen and Charles Bronson. It's a great Western. It's based on a movie called The Seventh Samurai, which is a black and white movie, which is also great. I highly recommend watching both of these movies. But in the Magnificent Seven, in the end scene, a number of the seven have passed away in this gun battle to protect a town from these bandits. And the scene, one guy says, "We won. This is great," or something to that effect. And the main character, Yul Brynner, says, "We lost. We always lose. Only the farmers won." And his point is, at least to me, is that if a prosecutor gets a conviction in a case, that doesn't mean a win. Like, we've lost. We've already lost because we're having a case. Somebody already got assaulted.
Absolutely.
Somebody already got shot. Somebody already got raped. Somebody already got stabbed. We already lost. This isn't like a win situation, in my opinion. And so I think that it's important to think about it in that way. We do hope to achieve some modicum of justice, some way of bringing about closure for the victims, for the family of the victims, for society generally. And we try to reach a level of safety where this kind of thing doesn't happen again. But I think that calling it a win, I think kind of minimizes or kind of shifts in I think some negative ways the way that we think about how trials work. And so that's the first thing that I would say. And then secondly, I completely agree that a lot of what prosecutors do is try to think about what constitutes a crime. And this is actually really important because I'm sure for the attorneys, everybody's really familiar with what DAs and prosecutors do, but for the folks that don't, prosecutors have this thing called prosecutorial discretion, and it's critical, and there's no check on it. The only check is the voting booth. That's it. And what prosecutorial discretion is prosecutors decide who gets charged and what they get charged with. And you're exactly right that power is incredibly strong. It's an incredibly powerful force in the criminal justice system and in the lives of people who get prosecuted and their families and the victims of the people who have suffered crimes. It's an incredibly powerful thing. And so it does need to be used judiciously. It does need to be used with discretion and thought. And it has to only be used when we can prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt. So those are I think the big sweeping ideas that came to mind when you asked me that question.
And that brings to mind, without saying which county or without saying any names, we've seen recent examples in the Bay Area of district attorneys taking a very novel approach to how they view their role as the district attorney in terms of maybe not prosecuting certain crimes or emphasizing one section of the types of crimes that they prosecute and maybe easing up on others, maybe easing up on sentencing, things like that. In terms of what Alameda County can expect from you if you were to be elected district attorney, do you have any priorities out of the gate that would be key themes of your tenure in that position?
Absolutely, and I know that's I'll try to see if I can give an overview. My website doesn't have all of the platform stuff up yet, but I think it will in the next day or two. And so for more information, you can go to SethStewardForDA.com and really check it out. And I'll try to give the highlights, and then maybe if you have any questions about a couple that you'd like me to drill down on, I'd be more than happy to.
Absolutely.
And so, as I said, we really want to focus on violent crime. I want to expand access to alternative courts and diversion opportunities and lead outside of the courthouse. So those were the first three. In addition to that, I want to expand victims' rights, end the death penalty, stop over-criminalizing youth, hold law enforcement accountable. I want to create a resentencing unit. More than happy to talk about all of these things. I want to protect immigrant communities, fight racism and bias, eliminate cash bail, and be smarter on crime and follow the science. So those kind of big, broad topics are the things that I would like to hit the ground running when I start.
Absolutely. And when we look at the, food chain is not the right word, but the entire cycle of when a crime gets committed, prosecuting that crime, somebody going to jail, and then somebody re-entering society. One of the biggest issues is, having that stain on somebody's record where, maybe they've done a crime, they've gone to prison, or they served a sentence or something like that. And then they come out and they have this question that they're going to get asked in every interview of, have you ever committed a serious crime or anything like that? And I think we've seen recently with some of the changes in certainly cannabis laws and things like that, where there's been a broader ability for certain folks to get expungements and of drug-related issues. And I'm wondering what your position is in terms of a broader access to expungements, especially for the lower level crimes of, maybe we can chalk this up to youthful indiscretion, or perhaps something that was, certainly a serious event that, the person shouldn't have done it, but they'd like to move on with their life and not have this follow them indefinitely.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree that if you have a felony, you should not be a second-class citizen, as a rule of thumb. The city of Oakland did something, I think either last year or the year before, I can't remember, I think the year before, where so when you go and apply to rent a place, if you want to rent a place to live, rent an apartment, lots of times the person will ask, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And the city of Oakland banned that question. So you can no longer ask that question. I think one exception, I think, is sexual assault conviction. If if the owner lives there. I can't remember exactly what the exception is right now, but there are some small exceptions to it. Point being, though, is that if you get convicted of a felony, you still should be able to rent someplace in the city of Oakland. And I think that should be true for every place, because people have to be able to have a place to live. They have to be able to get a job, to earn an income, and to put clothes on their back and food on the table. And that's really important. I'd also say that one of the things that I think is really important is that they should be able to vote. It's critical that they have an opportunity to vote. The state of Florida, I think, just recently passed legislation. It's tied up in the courts right now, but basically getting rid of the disenfranchisement law there, I think, is critical. And I think that it should also happen here. Just because you get convicted of a felony does not somehow make you a non-citizen. And I don't know why we think that that's okay.
Absolutely. And we have an adversarial system in this country where ideally we get to a verdict or a result in a trial by having two sides that are equally resourced with all access to the evidence, where a defendant is well represented, a district attorney's office is well represented. They've got both sides having the same level of resources. And even though a lot of times it's a prosecutor versus defense, or public defender, it's not necessarily a situation where those two sides can't work together. And in fact, many times prosecutors and defense counsel work together to either, get somebody a plea deal or something like that. But in general, in terms of working through changes to our system, can you think of any examples from your past of when you've worked with either a public defender's office or, some sort of collaborative policy making with folks on the defense side of the criminal bar?
Absolutely. So when I was talking about the alternative courts, the big thing about how that works, and we'll talk about behavioral health court, for example. So for somebody to be eligible for behavioral health court, it requires at least one, I think maybe two, I have to double check, and it depends on which county you're in, a diagnosis. So you either have to be bipolar, schizophrenic, something of that nature. And so what happens in that particular court, instead of being adversarial, it is collaborative. So much so that these courts are, in addition to called alternative courts, they're also called collaborative courts, because what happens is the judge, there's usually a case manager, the defense attorney, the prosecutor get together, sit down, have a conversation and say, hey, how can we best address this? How can we make sure that this person gets the services they need, so we're not in this situation in the future?
So Seth, I'm really interested in hearing more about your military service. I think that, I don't know about you, but I graduated college in 2001. And so it was right before 9/11, and even going into college, I had a Navy ROTC offer that I didn't take because I was in the gym one day and somebody said, well, if you don't want your career to be in the military, don't do ROTC. And I always think about it like, man, if I had done that, I certainly would have ended up in combat after 2001. And I'm wondering what inspired you to join the military, and what experiences from your military service have kind of shaped your professional career as a prosecutor?
So I had a number of family members who had served in the military. I remember my great grandmother's husband was in World War One. My grandfather fought in World War II. I had a great uncle who was in Korea. I had another great uncle who fought in Vietnam. My brother was in Iraq in 2005. And I hadn't thought about it. Kind of, I think, similar to you, where I was like thinking about it for a while, but I didn't actually. I said when I was absolutely sure I was going to do it was when two men blew up the Boston Marathon. So when that happened, I promised myself I was going to join the service, and I did.
And what I'm trying to think back, was that around like 2006 or so?
The Boston Marathon explosion happened on April 15th, 2013.
Okay, a couple of years later. Wow. So you were already mid-career at that point. And I gotta imagine that as an attorney, one of the things as an attorney is it's like, we always think like we don't have enough time, or we're super busy. We're kind of focused on advancing like vertically within wherever we're at. And so I have to imagine that, to kind of pivot from where you were going at that time to, joining the military, especially like, I think at that point you were were you in your 30s at that point?
Mm-hmm.
So like you even got to go through the basic training and everything like that. You're out there with 18-year-olds. Like how did that decision? I mean, you talked about some of the inspiration for your decision, but in terms of like, making the decision either with yourself or with your family to make that pivot, how did that how did that transition go?
It was interesting, I'll say, and let me just back up. I want to make sure that I add this part of the conversation. I was going to school in Boston at the time.
Okay.
So I had taken a year off from the DA's office to get a master's degree from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. So I was there. So that's, and some of my friends were at the finish line. And I wasn't. I was supposed to go cheer people that were running, and I missed it. I wasn't there. Thank goodness. That said, the other thing I wanted to just mention briefly is if anybody ever gets a chance to go to Boston, there's this thing called Boston Common, which is a park right in the middle of Boston, and it's near the State House. The State House is and it has a gold dome on it, and across the street from the State House is a memorial of the 54th Massachusetts, which is the first Black regiment in the history of America, and they fought in the Civil War. And it's hard to see that and not want to support your country in some way. Those men dedicated their lives to the ideas of democracy, the ideas of freedom. And when you see that memorial, it is very powerful. It's very powerful. It was very powerful to me. Okay, so a little bit about, yeah, you're right. I was in my mid-30s when I went to basic training, and I was running around with a whole bunch of young folks, and it was a hard pivot. And it was a difficult thing to do. I ended up doing, I served 8 years as a flight engineer on a combat search and rescue helicopter. I was deployed to both Iraq and then last year, Kenya. And the motto of Air Force Rescue is "These things we do that others may live." To answer your question directly, that motto sticks with you. And you think about when you bring yourself to, when you're dealing with prosecution, or when I'm teaching, or when I'm coming up with legislation, or I'm trying to figure out how to make things better for folks. That's what I think about. These things we do that others may live. And it's a critical, I think, mind shift. And I really believe it. It's a level of commitment that is, I'm honored to have been a part of, and it stays with me.
That's incredible. Had you ever been on a helicopter before you joined the Air Force?
Never. No.
were you behind I guess it's not a wheel. Were you behind the controls of the helicopter ever?
So no, so I'll explain a little bit about what a special missions aviator flight engineer does. So in the Air Force, the combat search and rescue helicopter has 4 crew members. There's a pilot, a co-pilot, a flight engineer, and a gunner. So those are the 4. And depending on your experience, co-pilots then become pilots. And then flight engineers and gunners can be interchangeable. The skill sets are similar. The flight engineer does a lot more work. And so, for example, if you saw when Hurricane Katrina happened, and there were all of these military helicopters that were lowering down a hoist and then picking people up off of roofs, that's a lot of the kind of rescue work that we do. And it was very powerful stuff. And so the person in the back, the person working the hoist, is a flight engineer. And so when we can't land, that's what we do. And then also when we're in combat, the flight engineer and the gunner are the ones that are manning the firearms, and we're considered a defensive platform in the sense that as combat search and rescue, we fly in, rescue people, and then get out of there. And generally, we're not using it's not an offensive or attack platform. It's considered a defensive platform.
So that's incredible, and again, I can't imagine uprooting my life as a lawyer to go and do something like that. And it's just so impressive that you found a way to make time in your already established career to make that journey. So again, thank you for your service, and that's just incredible. And I have some rapid fire questions for the end, but I have one more topic that I want to get to before we wrap up with those rapid fire questions. You're in a position right now where let's say that the election goes your way and you become the next district attorney for the county of Alameda. You're going to be thrust into an incredibly public position where whether you do a fantastic job or just an average job, there are going to be people who don't like the outcome. That you're going to be a target. Your name is going to be out there. People are going to have opinions about you. And I'm just wondering whether you have any similar experiences in the past with dealing with this level of anticipated public scrutiny, or if you have any sort of approaches going in for how to deal with what may come in terms of you being a part of the public conversation.
I haven't. This will be all new to me. This is relatively new stuff, and so it's one of those things where I don't know how that's going to unfold, and I'm excited about it. I think that it's great that people have an opportunity to think about the role of the district attorney and whether or not they agree or disagree with what's happening. I think that's really important. I think knowing who your DA is critical, because that is the person that has an incredible amount of influence and power in what happens in the criminal justice system. So I actually think that I'm sure it's going to be difficult. It's nothing I've had any kind of experience with or an opportunity to deal with before. But that said, I think that it's great that people think about the criminal justice system and want to really consider how it affects their lives and the lives of their community members and the people that live here. So yeah.
Well, I know that one of the things that differentiates an attorney in private practice from one in the public is that you're always on. I mean, I'm sure you've experienced this already from the standpoint of you might be in the grocery store and somebody recognizes you from court or something like that, and it's just it's a tough part about it. But I assume that if you've been on a helicopter in a combat zone, it kind of puts things in perspective. Would you agree with that?
I think the stresses can be different.
Yeah.
But it's I think it definitely helps having been on a helicopter.
Okay, fair
It
enough.
definitely
All
helps,
right.
yeah.
Well, Seth, I'm gonna finish up. I had 10 kind of, lightning round questions. I think we touched on some of these already, so it might be less than that. But I'm gonna try to move through these and try to say the first thing that comes to your mind. So, question number one, what would be a book in your top 5 that you would recommend to a new lawyer?
Stand from the Beginning is the book that came to mind by
I'm
Ibn
so,
Sina.
can you say that again?
Actually, I'm going to give 2 books: Stamped
Okay.
from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi
Okay.
and The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander.
Awesome. What was the toughest moment so far of your professional career?
When you do combat search and rescue, sometimes the person that you rescue doesn't live. That's hard.
I can imagine. What is a top criminal justice reform that you would like to see implemented either locally or beyond?
The first 3 things that I mentioned, in terms of focusing on violent crime, increasing the expanding access to alternative courts, and then leading outside of the courtroom.
Who is the one opposing counsel that you've ever faced who has impressed you the most?
Oh man, that's a tough one. They're all really good. I mean, everybody that I've had a trial with has been pretty amazing in my opinion.
A perfect day for you involves what activity?
Working out.
Me too. That's always a great start. Do you work out in the morning or in the evenings or midday?
It depends on when I have time. But I try to do it in the morning. If I can't do it in the morning, I try to do it at lunch.
Okay. If you were not an attorney, what would you be doing right now?
Teaching.
And you've been teaching at Merritt College. How's that been?
It's great. So I actually teach a dual enrollment class. It's on criminal law at Oakland Tech through Merritt. So there's Merritt students there and high school students at Oakland Tech. So it's great. It's one of the most fulfilling experiences that I've had.
What's a music album in your top 5 that doesn't get enough recognition?
Well, it did when it came out, but To Pimp a Butterfly by Kendrick Lamar, I just don't hear as much as I used to.
Fair enough. That's a great one. What's the number one thing that you crave in the Bay Area when you've been away for too long?
Food at Alamar.
Alamar? Nice. Yeah. And this is the last question that I have. What so far has been the most rewarding moment of your professional career?
The best part about doing combat search and rescue is you get to save somebody.
I think that's a great place to end. Seth Steward, thank you so much for your time. As I mentioned, we don't pick favorites at C.H.B.A. We haven't endorsed anybody, but I wish you so much success and luck in the race coming up. And this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. It's been a wonderful opportunity. Thanks for taking the time. I really appreciate it, Nate. Good to see you.
Thanks, Seth.